All right. Oh, whoa. Hopefully you got the handout and you're ready to work our way through a little Hebrews tonight. Get us back up to speed after a couple weeks away for holidays and other various reasons. Find your way to chapter 12. Last time we talked about Hebrews, we finished chapter 11 in the so-called Hall of Faith and moving on now into chapter 12. Picking up at verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. But later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So, let's do our recap. Put ourselves back in context, back in position to where we are in the book as we've been following the argument. Remember, big picture. Chapters 1 through 10, the authors dedicated all those chapters to a theological defense of the greatness of Christ. It's the theological section of the letter. It's here are the reasons, much like the author of Romans builds it, all the theological stuff up front. And what his case has been, what his argument has been from the beginning, is that the author, he's wanting to make the point that the new covenant is greater than the old. He does it in various ways, talks about Moses, talks about the sacrifices, talks about the priests, and so forth. But big picture, his point is, as good as the old covenant was, because it was from God, it is not as good as the new covenant. Because what are they thinking about doing? Remember, what's the context of the letter as a whole? They're thinking about going back to Judaism, back to living under the old covenant, and he's telling them, don't do it. Why? Ultimately, Jesus is the fulfillment of those Old Testament types. Remember, pictures. Melchizedek was a type of Christ, a foreshadow. He's the fulfillment of those types and the prophecies. If you want to go back to the Old Testament, do so knowing everything it's talking about is pointing to Jesus. So use the analogy I used months and months and months ago for us now. It's like wanting to stop at the road sign and that's your destination. Why would you stop at the road sign and go home? You'd finish the trip. That's chapters 1 through 10, big picture. Chapter 11, what we looked at for the last few weeks before this, he dedicated to a historical defense of the greatness of Christ. It's a historical defense. Here he's made the case that those saints, that was we would call them, from the Old Testament, every one of them, he says, operated in faith. They're operating in faith. By faith, Moses did this. By faith, whatever the case might have been, Lot, and so forth. But they're operating in faith. He also pointed out, and we need to make sure it's clear here, that the kind of faith the author is talking about, functions on two different levels. The examples he gives, those exemplars in the old, are doing this. Faith, the kind the Bible's talking about, first of all, looks backwards to God's faithfulness in the past. Right? That's why we talk about faith is built on something. Remember, this is why I've harped in various times and places why I hate that language of we need to take a leap of faith. Taking a leap of faith suggests you don't really have a good reason to do it. You just hope God's going to do it. Biblical faith is always based on what God has already proven. So it's based on his faithfulness in the past. That's why all those historical books in the Old Testament. Why do we study about the march through the wilderness? Why do we study about all these fallen kings? Because God remained faithful through it all. And so, first of all, real biblical faith has to look backwards at God's faithfulness. It also, though, looks to God's promises in the future. It's a both and. It's not either or. It's trust me for this thing that's coming because you know I'm trustworthy from the things in the past. Go back and read the prophets, the minor prophets particularly. Over and over, they're telling people, this morning I covered, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah in class. And I showed them as we were going through those books, and two of those three, God is telling Israel, one day I'm going to destroy the Babylonians, for example, in Zephaniah. But Zephaniah is telling them this 40 years before the Babylonians destroy them. So they're not going, yay, celebrate, the Babylonians are dying. You're going, why are the Babylonians going to die again? Oh, they're going to crush us first. And so God tells them, trust me. Habakkuk is like Jeremiah. He complains to God. In his letter or prophecy, he's complaining, why would you use those people to do this to us? Same thing Jeremiah complained about in the book of Jeremiah. And God basically says, this is why the righteous man lives by faith. In other words, Jeremiah, you got to trust me. Or not Jeremiah, Habakkuk. You've got to trust me. Why? Because you know you can. It's future faith requires past faithfulness. And so, same thing true with these prophets we're looking at here. Looking back at God's faithfulness and looking forward to God's promises. And the reason, of course, the author gives us all those examples in chapter 11 is to call his reader, and now us as his modern reader, to live the same way. To live by faith. Faith in what you've seen. But remember, as we went through chapter 11, how many of those examples does he point out didn't actually ever get to see the thing they had faith in? They died before they could see it. And then he says, now, if you want to use the language, they're living vicariously through us because we now can look backwards to see what they were looking forward to. And so, if they can go through all they did, and he talks about people being sawn in two and whatnot, if they can do that in faith, even though they never see the answer, he's telling the people he's writing to, you're a bunch of wimps. You want to quit and go home to mommy, theologically. You've not even suffered yet, is what he tells us in chapter 12. And you can see what those people never got to see. How weak are you? And so he says we need to live by faith. That's what leads us up then to chapter 12. Look at verse 1 again. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. By the way, I don't have a mark for it here on the handout. Notice that's one sentence. He's building and building and building to the crest of his argument here in chapter 12. But notice, how does he begin chapter 12? Therefore. Therefore. That's the way, and again, this is one of the reasons it might be Paul who's writing this letter. People would argue it's built just like Romans, all the theology, then the practical. But when Paul does that in Romans chapter 12, if you go back and look at Romans chapter 12, He's just finished all the theology up through chapter 11. And then Paul says, since then, therefore, and then he goes on. So here's this language of, I'm connecting what I'm about to tell you, practically speaking, with what I've been arguing with you theologically speaking, therefore. Or, to put it my paraphrase, the Peter Beck unauthorized version, because all that is true, you're going to live necessarily according to that truth. If that all's true, here's what you must do. So it's not let me continue my argument logically with you. It's to say, I have proven one thing undeniably, conclusively. You can't deny everything I've just said. I proved my point theologically. I proved my point historically. Therefore, here's the only logical answer next. You have no rebuttal at this point if you're his audience. And then he makes the move to that passage that people love to talk about, and I think many of us get it wrong. When he talks about that great cloud of witness. Therefore, since we have this great cloud of witnesses, and we start talking about it, I've heard sermons preached about it. I think they're wrong. Every once in a while I say that about people. I think these guys are wrong when they do it. The great cloud of witnesses that he's talking about is referring to the courtroom, not the arena. I think he mixes metaphors. And I think a lot of people miss that shift in his argument. They hear great cloud of witnesses, and then they read about let's run the race, and they assume the cloud of witnesses is standing in the bleachers at the Rose Bowl watching them. But that makes no sense to what he's just argued in chapter 11. It also makes no sense theologically, and this is why we get such messed up ideas that, grandma's in heaven watching what I'm doing right now. I don't know about you, but that kind of freaks me out. Does grandma go to sleep? Am I okay at night when she's not watching everything I do? Right? Is she watching what I eat? Is she going into the bed? I mean, this is when I go George Carlin, right? Those of you old enough to remember George Carlin. Things that make you go, They're not in heaven watching us. They're in heaven watching God. So what's this great cloud doing? It's like a courtroom. What he's essentially saying at the beginning of the argument is, what we are doing is we are watching them. By looking at chapter 11, we're looking at them, right? We're watching them, and we're watching them give their testimony. What the author has done is he's put every one of them on the witness stand. You want to go back to Judaism? Let's hear what Moses has to say about that. You think you want to go back and do this? Let's talk about Barak or Gideon. You think that's the way to do it? Let's actually get somebody who lived that way. Right? Isn't that so often, when we get older, we tend to, think about the good old days. But if you're honest, the good old days weren't necessarily that good. And your good old days were oftentimes somebody else's really bad old days. But, oh man, it'd be great to go back and live like the Puritans in the 1700s. I've been sleeping on the floor in my cabin for weeks. You all don't want to live that way. They're putting on the witness stand like a courtroom. They're the witnesses. We have this great cloud of what? Witnesses. They're giving us their account of what they saw and did. So we're watching them give their testimony. They are not watching us. I think every sermon you've ever heard, I've ever heard from this passage where we're in the arena and we're about to race and they're watching us misses the entire point. He just spent an entire chapter saying, look at these people. Why would he all of a sudden switch? Oh, by the way, they're watching you. So they've given us their testimony. They've given us their account in chapter 11. We're to look at them and learn from them. And then based on what we've learned, the therefore, notice what he does not even in the middle of verse 1, early still in verse 1. The author switches to his favorite phrase. Mark has a favorite phrase, it's immediately. Moses has a favorite phrase. Many of his books, the first 5, the sentence always begins with then or now then. That's his version of therefore. This, now this. What's the author of Hebrews' favorite phrase he keeps coming back to? Let us. The whole book is a call to action. Even in the theological section, he says, let us repeatedly. Here he is now again, let us. Let us, he says. And then using that phrase as his transition point to the practical argument, he's going to argue that two things naturally flow out of what we just witnessed. Right? If you just witnessed a car accident, you're going to change how you go through that same intersection. Or if you're those who've been lived up north, you're driving down the road and it seems perfect and two cars in front of you spins out because they hit black ice. What do you do when you go through there? It changes how you drive through that place. So he says, since we've seen them, let us do something different. And so he uses that let us as his pivot point. Two things he says we need to do now. First of all, he says, if we've learned their lesson, we will prepare for the race that's in front of us. We don't get to run their race, and they don't get to run ours, because we've watched how they've run their race. We've heard their testimonies. We're going to prepare for our race a little different. So he says, let us run the race that's set before us. Not the race that's set before them. Not the race that's set before some other group down the road. Let us prepare for our race. And he says there's two things we got to do there, doesn't he? If we're going to run our race and run it well, you're not going to be looking into the stands, are you? What happens when you look in the stands when you run? You fall, right? One of the things you learn in driver's ed, some of you long, long time ago. In fact, when you took driver's ed, it was Ed who taught you how to drive. But he told you, keep your eye where? On the road. Because what happens when you drive automatically? Your eyes and then the wheel. Right? You steer where you're looking. So you're not looking to them, you're looking at the race in front of you. And to run it well, to prepare to run it well, you first of all have to set aside anything which is going to hinder your effort. Let us lay aside every weight. Now we go, man, what idiot would run a race carrying weights? But what do all of us do all the time? We try to do this Christian thing with all of our baggage, don't we? Right? We carry our grudges rather than getting rid of them. We keep trying to, well, I would do that, but was 50 years ago. It's time to move on from that but. Find a new one to lean on. But we got to lay aside whatever that weight is that hinders you. Maybe it's yours as attitude. Maybe yours is unforgiveness. Maybe it's yours as the baggage from, well, I grew up in a home that did X. Okay, so what? Set it aside. Move on. Move forward. And of course, what's the most obvious burden we need to set aside? Sin. It kills me to hear Christians, often students, share it with me. Well, Dr. Beck, I'm struggling with my Christian walk, blah, 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 blah. And then they talk about trying to keep their pet sin. We all have a pet sin or two or a dozen. Ones that you really kind of like and you don't really want to quite give them up. And so we nurture it. We feed these pet sins. And what are they going to do every time? They're going to trip you up. I don't run. For a lot of reasons, I don't run anymore. I always tell people, if I'm running, you better run too. But, used to try to take our dogs for long walks. Now, they're big dogs. They got to be able to keep up with me. Problem is, you take two big dogs, what are they going to do? This way or that way? And I've got really long arms, really wide arm span. I can't walk dogs like that. And I see people out running with their dogs and going, how do you do that? I try to run my dogs. The white one would sit down and look at me going, you're kidding, right? And then Bear would chase every smell down the road. I couldn't run with the dogs if I wanted to. But many of us, all of us, try to run with our sin. And then we wonder why we don't ever get any faster in our run. Right? I want to get in shape this year. New Year's resolution's coming in a few weeks. I'm going to get in shape this year. But we don't want to change what we eat. Guess what? You can run better and faster, but you're never going to get in shape doing just one part of that equation. Same thing here. We've got to prepare for the race. Determine what the race is, and then prepare. Because actually, at the end of the day, your goal determines your preparation, doesn't it? If you want to run sprints, the 100-meter, you don't go out and run 10 miles a day. Conversely, if you want to run a 10K, you don't just go sprint down to the corner and walk back. Where you want to go determines how you train to get there. So he says, first of all, we've got to let us set aside all this stuff. We've got to prepare for the race. The second let us is, if we're actually believing the testimony of those witnesses, we're going to run with endurance. We're going to run with endurance. Again, Paul likes that imagery. It's another argument for why Paul might be the author. Paul talks about running the race. He says, Paul to Timothy, no one starts the race with the intention of quitting it. We run to win, right? You want to win the crown, Paul says. Same thing here. You're going to run the race with endurance. But think about the analogy he's now making, this analogy of running, setting aside and so forth. If we're going to run with endurance, one of the things we've got to realize, and what his audience needed to realize way back when, is that runners don't define the race. Now you go, well, I decide if I want to run a marathon or not. Okay, yeah, sure. You don't get to pick the course. When you show up at Boston, or if you show up downtown Charleston at the old Navy base, and you want to run the Charleston Marathon, you don't set the course. You run wherever the course takes you. So the only thing you've got to do is just keep running, right? It's one foot in front of another, to quote a particular Christmas cartoon that should be coming up soon, right? Put one foot in front of the other. You know, use a Disney analogy for the younger crowds. You got to just keep swimming. So you run with endurance. You don't get to define the race. The race gets to define you. Because not only do you not get to set the course, somebody else has done it, the race course itself, in one sense, determines how you experience your race, doesn't it? A couple years ago, several years ago, I was doing a lot of walking 10, 12, 13 miles a day with a heavy pack. I wanted to walk the Appalachian Trail, at least part of it. I was in good shape. I got to the mountain, and the mountain got to me. Because it determined how I experienced the walk. I couldn't go, you know what, I'm going to walk the level path over here. If you've never been on any part of the Appalachian Trail, there is no level part. The level part, as close as I got, was in the parking lot down to the beginning of the trail. After that, there was nothing level. It was up or it was down. The race defines your experience. You can be in great shape, but if you go and run a race that's on a mountainous course, you're in trouble. And so the only thing you can do, the only thing you can control, is do you keep going or not? So he says we've got to determine to be prepared for the race as best we can get ready, get rid of our garbage, and then we've got to determine that we're going to run it with endurance no matter what the course throws at us, and just keep running. So we're looking at them. We've learned their lesson. It's encouraging us. It's motivating us. I can do this because they can do it, and then let's go do it. But at the end of the day, verse 2 says, you ultimately must follow Christ's example. Yeah, it's all well and good. Look at Moses, to be encouraged by how Moses did all this. But Christ is the ultimate example for this. And it says that he is the founder and perfecter. That's language comparable perhaps to Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. But I think what the author is using here when he talks about Christ as the founder and perfecter, I think he's speaking of Christ's will. He's the founder. He came up with the plan. It was his will and his ways. He came up with the plan and he accomplished the plan. Christ decided to run the course set before him, 30 plus years on earth, and then he did it. And he didn't quit till he got to the end of the race. I think it's appropriate. I didn't pick up on it yesterday when I was working on this. It's appropriate the language we're seeing in Hebrews 12 tonight is really a perfect setup or explanation for us for what we're reading in Mark on Sunday mornings. Because he's been through the trials, and he's still going. This week, they're going to take him outside away from the governor, and they're going to mock him and beat him. And he kept going. Remember, at any point, Jesus could have done what? I'm done. You're it. Knock them all over. But he keeps going. So he becomes the ultimate example. He's the founder, his plan, and he's the perfecter. He's the completer. Remember, oftentimes in the New Testament, when you see the word perfecter or perfect your faith, it's the idea of completes. It finishes. Paul to the Ephesians. The husband doesn't perfect his wife. The husband's goal is to help her complete the course. And so we're looking at Jesus' example. And how did Jesus run according to verse 2? It says he ran the course that had been set for him. How? With joy. I don't know about you. I find no joy in running. Even when I could do it and could do it fairly well at one point in my younger days, I never enjoyed running for the sake of running. Now think what Jesus goes through, and he says he did it with joy. Now remember, joy is not happiness. We talked about this when we did Philippians a long time ago here. Philippians doesn't say count it all happiness. Happiness is based on what's happening to you externally. Is Jesus happy about what he's going through? No. Joy is internal. It's an internal response to external stimuli. And so Jesus is running the race with joy. And along the way, what he had to do was he endured the cross. Don't forget what course he ran, is the author's point. He endured the cross despite the shame of it. And think of all the shame. The public mockings, the public beatings, of course the crucifixion, the death itself, but even dying, the dying was an embarrassment. He's dying as a criminal, but he's also dying completely nude in front of thousands of people coming and going for the feast. He endured it. He put up with it, and he finished the course. And now, because he's finished the course, the author says, now he enjoys the reward. The reward was not in the running. There's no fun in the running. The reward comes at the end. Now it says he's sitting at the right hand of the throne of God. Now he's been given his reward for running the race. So he's the example now. He's shifting from the Old Testament folks who showed to their audience, don't come back and look at us. Look forward. Look at Christ's example. Now, look at verse 3. Consider, this command, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. So he shifted our attention from the Old Testament saints to our own feet as we run the race. But what they did is not enough to keep us going. It's not enough for me to tell you, oh, it's easy. My grandfather ran the race of faith. Okay, you're going to get it's easy for your grandfather. Okay, let's look at Jesus. And so verse 3 in that paragraph is all about following Christ's example then. If you follow his example, he says believers can endure. Looking at him. Now, of course, thinking just pragmatically here, what did Jesus tell the disciples? Pick up your cross and follow me. And so you're following somebody who knows the course. He knows when to speed up. He knows when to slow down. He knows when the turns are coming. He knows where it's going to be hard, and he prepares and adjusts accordingly. So following his example, believers can, in fact, endure. And then just to make sure we understand exactly what his example entailed, he says, look, he suffered hostility. It wasn't just a little persecution. It was hostility for us on our behalf. And he did so And because he did so, we shouldn't give up so easily. You know, this generation sometimes, gets accused of being snowflakes. Their generation too. Compared to what Jesus put up with? Yeah. How quick do we want to quit when it gets rough? Every day. He's 100% right, and they're agreeing with you. They're back to going, yep. But he's going, now look what Jesus went through for you. And think about that the next time you think about quitting. Not because he did it, you can. It's because he did it, you will. He's making the shift. So he says, consider Christ's example. It goes on, verse 4, and says, look, he in fact willingly died at the hands of his persecutors. He died. His race required his death. But he says, you haven't even reached that point yet, and you want to quit. He says, you haven't even shed blood yet. The persecution's emotional. The people are making fun of you. You're losing your jobs. He lost his life. Put it in perspective. And then he pulls out an Old Testament text again. Remember how much the author of Hebrews likes the Old Testament? He pulls out an Old Testament text. He quotes directly, at length this time, from Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. He uses Proverbs to make his point. You are suffering a little, he said. He's, in one sense, not mocked them, but shamed them for being so quick to give up. You haven't suffered much yet. But before you rush to quit your suffering, to get over it, to avoid it, he says, let me teach you a little Bible lesson about suffering. And so he reads for them, or writes for them, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. Let's go back and reread it. Make sure you know what he's talking about. My son, do not regard. So he said, consider Jesus, think about him. Now, don't regard, think about it lightly. Do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastises every son whom he receives. So that's the text he's looking at. And he says, if you think about that text, if you understand it, he says, knowing it, knowing what the text is arguing, is going to help you to do two things. One, understand what you're going through, to make sense of what situation you're in, and it's going to help you endure it. He's not just telling you to get over it. He's saying, let me explain to you why you're going through what you're going through. And knowing it will help you understand a little better. But it's not enough to understand, right? Biblically, we're always talking about moving from orthodoxy, right? Thinking about something, to orthopraxy. And so he says, let's make sure we understand. And then he says, when you suffer for your faith, see it as a form of discipline. Not self-discipline. I'm going to discipline myself to read the Bible through next year. It's a form of discipline external to you, coming on you. They're going to agree. They're going to go, man, this is outside of us and we don't like it. But that's why he's quoting this book, or in this section from Proverbs. He wants them to understand that God is the source of both their suffering and the discipline. Remember Job. When Job is disciplined, he's suffering, right? Chapter 1 and 2. What is Job's answer when people ask him, how do you put up with all this? What Job says? First time, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Then when his wife says, why don't you just curse God and die? Thank you, honey, for the support. Job's answer to her is, you speak like one of the foolish women. How can we not accept from God the good, but also the bad? We don't get to pick. And so the author here wants you to understand, your suffering, the things they were going through, the things that they were thinking about leaving Christianity over, he's going, no, God is doing that. It may be the Romans or the Jews who are mocking you or whatever, but God is ultimately behind it. He's the source. And what is motivating him, according to verse 6, is what? Love. is God's motivation. God is actually allowing these things in your life, causing them in your life, not because he hates you, not because he's forgotten about you, because he loves you. And it's such a love, he says in verse 6, that this paternal love, he loves you like a father, this paternal love is actually preparing you for eternity. You're worried about this momentary light affliction. Read that somewhere in the Bible before? It's momentary, and compared to the weight of glory, it's light. God's readying us for eternity. These 70 plus 10 or whatever we now get of life is preparation for eternity. And so you look at it, you approach your sufferings differently. And so God is behind this, he says. And then the next paragraph builds on that and explains all that for us, starts bringing the pieces together. Verse 7, it's for discipline that you have to endure. Now, notice it's not you have to endure as discipline. It's for discipline that you have to endure. It's an interesting variation. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness in those who have been trained by it. And so, to his audience and to us, what he's saying is we endure suffering for the sake of godly discipline. It's not your parents making you go to the weight room and punish you. Well, you didn't eat your vegetables. Go work out till it hurts. It's you go to the weight room to gain the discipline. It's not a punishment. The discipline, in a sense, is the reward. Completely different way of thinking about what they go through and what we're going through. And you go, how do you do that? That's backwards. What's his answer in verse 7? When this happens, what you recognize, or what you need to recognize, is God is actually treating you like he did Christ. He's treating you as sons. And ladies, that's not a weird gender thing, especially in Welcome to 2022. In the ancient culture, ladies, you want to be a son. Not because it's better to be a male. Who gets the inheritance? The sons. So God is treating all Christians, male and female, not only as equals with each other, he's treating us as equals with Christ. That changes how you think about what you're going through a little bit. And then he adds, by the way, even your earthly fathers treat children this way. Now, does the author know there are bad earthly fathers? Yes. You know, I get students all the time who give me, well, my dad was horrible, or my dad was abusive, or what. We get it. But we all know as we look at parents around us, we go, that's what they're doing. They're doing it for the kids' best when we see this, when it's done well, when it's done right. So he says, this is not a new concept. This is one you've observed in your own world. That he builds on it. Verse 8. The lack of discipline actually proves your illegitimacy. If you've not been disciplined, what does that say about your relationship to your father? And if God is not disciplining you, what does it say to you about your relationship with him as father? And the answer is, there is none. If your father loved you, he would discipline you for your good. If God is not disciplining you for your good, what's the result? He doesn't love you. And then he returns back in verse 9. He says, look, back to your human relationships. If we expect such things from our fathers, godly, loving discipline, why wouldn't we accept it, not expect it, accept it from God? It's not that it's going to be enjoyable, but you're recognizing there's a benefit to it. Because as he says in verse 9, godly discipline actually ends up bringing life. He's disciplining us for our life, for our eternal life. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? So why would you run from that which is actually bringing you life? And the answer is you'd run foolishly. You'd run out of error. That's why he's trying to correct that error. So, Father heavenly, Father earthly, Father heavenly, Father earthly. Verse 10 comes back to that dichotomy, the illustration. Earthly discipline, he admits, is what? Imperfect. Your earthly father did it. Hopefully he did it for the right reason. But earthly discipline is short-lived. He only does it for a season, right? You hit 18 or 20 or 14 or whatever it would have been, and then he's done with you. I often warn young couples as I do premarital counseling or thinking about children. I said, your job as a parent is to get your kid ready to be an adult. Whether you get 16 years or 18 years or whatever, that's your number one goal beyond leading them to Christ, is to prepare them for life without you. But it's short-lived. You only get X amount of time. And he says about earthly discipline, you're guided by imperfect knowledge. Earthly fathers don't know everything. We prepare our children for what we think will happen, but we have no idea, right? How many parent is caught unaware with a situation you never imagined you'd have to confront? You thought you had done everything to get your kid right to avoid X, and Y ended up being what trips them up. So, yeah, we want to do our best. We're doing it because we love them, but we only have a certain amount of time. God has eternity. We only know some of the details. But what does God know? God knows everything. His knowledge is perfect. Now, compare the Father on earth's minuscule attempt, imperfect attempt. Verse 10 tells us, godly discipline, however, is for our good. God, who knows all things, knows what you need, both to get through this life and to get you into eternity. So he's disciplining you for your good. And what is the good? What is the goal according to verse 10? It's holiness. Godly holiness. He is disciplining us to make us like him. He is working the sin out of us, working the holiness in. So the discipline, this thing that we want to avoid and get away from, these people are thinking about leaving over. The author is saying, look, God's getting you ready for his presence through this. And when he's doing this, when he's getting you ready for holiness, he's getting you ready to share an attribute with God, to use our language from Sunday nights. Holiness is one of those communicable attributes. Something that God has inherently that we can have through the work of the Spirit, through the work of discipline. God created us in his image, and what's he doing in salvation? Recreating us in his image. It's Jeremiah 18, right? He's the potter, we're the clay. This lump is messed up, so what does the potter do? He reshapes it into the image he wants. That's discipline. And sometimes it hurts to be reshaped. That's why he says in verse 11, as we wrap up this tonight, discipline is painful. It's not pleasant. Weightlifters, bodybuilders, You ever watch them? What do they look like in a gym? Looks like it's killing them. Use back to our analogy from the early part of the lesson. Ever watch a runner? I mean, really watch runners who run marathons? Do they look like they're really enjoying themselves? They tell you that, oh, yeah, I got endorphins going like crazy, man. Yeah, dude, that's the only thing keeping you going because you look like you're about to die. In fact, some of you going, if I tried to run a marathon, I would die. Older folks, remember a guy named Jim Fixx, F-I-X-X? He's the father of the modern running craze in America. You know how he died? Heart attack, when? While running a marathon. The very thing he was doing to save his life killed him. It is painful. It's not supposed to be pleasant. As he's been saying throughout this Passion Night, discipline's meant to be endured, not enjoyed. So the author's admitting to his audience, yeah, I get why you want to leave. I understand why you're crying under the burden. But don't forget, he says, those who actually do endure it will bear spiritual fruit. You'll bear fruits of the Spirit. Galatians 5:22 and following. So then what's going on in all this, the author says, real quick at the end. He says we are being trained. God is using the discipline to train us for righteousness. He's training us for righteousness. First time you decide you want to run, I'm going to look at you funny and go, why? You start on January 1st, you're going to start running this year. You go out and you start off and you're energetic and you're excited, and by the end of the block, what are you doing? Walking. If you're foolish enough to get up tomorrow and do it again, it hurts more. Same thing when I was riding a bicycle. First day's fun. Second day, you can't hardly sit on the seat. But you keep doing it. But you have to train yourself, don't you? That's why Paul talks about being buffeted, about being beaten. Right? You want to be a professional boxer? And we all go, man, look at those 40 minutes in the ring. You know, who wants to get beat like that? Don't forget, what have they been enduring for months before the beating? Beatings. You're getting beaten for the preparation for getting beaten. But he says, here's the benefit. You are getting beaten. You're being buffeted. But you're being prepared for righteousness. You're down, but you're not out. And so he's encouraging them and us. Avoid the natural temptation to do what when life gets rough? Snowflake out. Stick to it. Because A, there's a better purpose for it than you may realize yet. But where's the prize? At the end of the race, not in the race. You don't get a participation trophy 5 miles into the marathon. You get that silly little necklace, the little medal. You're going, it ain't worth the medal, brother. But you don't get the medal to the end. That's suffering. That's discipline. God is doing it. He's running you through the ringer. Because we're called at the beginning to set aside all those encumbrances and sin. But what do? We want to hang on to them, so what must God do? Like an old-fashioned rug, he takes us out onto the porch and beats it out of us. Because otherwise we want to hang on to it. And so, as I often tell, especially students who are sometimes having the first hard times in their lives, yeah, when the building's on fire, get out of the building. But in your rush to get out of the building, make sure you're thinking clearly enough to understand which way you're supposed to go out of the building. When we're suffering, we want to get out of the suffering so quickly that often we miss the point of the suffering. And sometimes what we do is we end up missing the blessing of it. We avoided the hard stuff. Yeah, I went out running and I started breathing and I got shin splints and I thought I was going to vomit, so I quit. Okay, the suffering just ended, but guess what the running did for you? Nothing. You've got to keep on running. That's what he's telling his audience. You all want to quit. Go back to the Old Testament. I've shown you there's no reason to go back. You all want to go back because your heroes are back there. No, your heroes want to be up here. Doesn't mean they still don't want to quit. So what's he got to tell them now? Let me explain to you why your suffering is good. And here's why you don't want to quit. And that's a good reminder for us. It's not when the going gets tough, what happens? That's very John Wayne. When the going gets tough, we just keep going. Because we have faith that what's at the end is better than what we had before the suffering began. I'm going to be better for having done this than I will be if I quit because of this. Just keep running. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you this night for your lesson in life. Lord, everybody in the room has suffered some far more than others, some more than we can imagine. But Lord, our suffering is personal and it's ours. No matter how bad somebody else's is, mine is just as bad to me. Lord, give us faith to get us through whatever we're going through. Remind us, Lord, use this passage to set before us the hope that is always before us, that we're running for the crown of life, an award that we can only get when we get to the end. Lord, give us endurance. Give us strength. Lord, give us insight into what you're doing. Even if we'll never understand it now, may we, Lord, at least, Lord, trust you to do what for us is what's best for us. It's for all this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.